And Moses, he said, was his rabbi. Said Moses taught us that the question isn't only what I want, but what does God require of me? You know, my father always had a way of turning things upside down. So even the title of his book, God in Search of Man. It's not that we're looking for God. He doesn't start with proofs for the existence of God. That's so human-centered. Instead, he says, God is in search of us. God is in need of us. We are needed. And turning the picture in a different way. What does it mean to be an object of divine concern? How do we shape our lives? How do we think of ourselves in that way? And I have to tell you a wonderful, just a little phrase from a text that I came across by one of my father's ancestors, the person he was named for, Avram Yeshua Heschel of Abt. The Abderov is also called the Oy Yisrael. And he writes in a little text, it's just the quintessence of my father's teaching, which is so much derived from Hasidism. He writes in the text, you know, we think of God in human terms. We anthropomorphize, so we speak of the arm of God, the finger of God, because we think of God in human terms. And then he says, but how does God see us? How do we appear? And you know, think about it. What does that mean? When God sees us, are we imaged in divine terms? How can we even begin to think that thought? It's an extraordinary idea. My father was so deeply influenced and so deeply immersed in Hasidic teachings. They really were the foundation of his work. And yet there is a tendency to think that in Hasidism, Hasidic Jews are somehow isolated from the world. But actually, Hasidic teaching means to be deeply involved in the world. Everything has significance, and the world needs us. God needs us. How can there be holiness in this world? Think of the commandment. God gives us the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. We make the day holy, my father always emphasized. How is the world to be redeemed? Through justice. Where does justice come about? That's our obligation. My father used to say, the worst thing is to put religion together with race, because the two are complete contradictions. Religion brings us together. Race tears us apart. The danger, he said, was that people start to have a racist way of thinking. Sometimes they don't even know how deeply ingrained it is. He said, what a pity at the Exodus that Pharaoh didn't join the Jews to leave. And who's Pharaoh? We are. Indifference, he said, was the opposite of religion. Indifference. You can't be indifferent if you're a religious person. You can't speak of God and remain silent about Vietnam. That's blasphemy, he said. More than that, he spoke about idolatry. What's idolatry? What is an idol? An idol, he said, is to say, this is my God and not yours. Idolatry is to say, God is concerned about me and not about you. He used to say, either God is the father of all human beings, or God is not the creator. It can't be otherwise. And what was so important, he said, was to have an audacity of faith. An audacity of faith. Faith means to reject what seems plausible. It makes sense, it's easier. Said, when you go to the synagogue, your prayer should be subversive. Subversive? You know, it sounds very 60s, doesn't it? Subversive. It means when you leave the synagogue, you shouldn't pat yourself in the back and say, ah, what a good person I am, I went to the synagogue. On the contrary, you should be upset with yourself. I'm not living up to the words of the prayer. A religious person, he said, can never say I'm a good person, because you're always questioning yourself, as he did. The problem, he said, was that we human beings have a history of indifference that begins with the statement in the Bible, am I my brother's keeper? How do we overcome that? That's our challenge, he said. And so, for him, everything that you do has to be infused with the holy. How do you do that? He says God is in need of us because God too needs to be redeemed. What does that mean, God needs to be redeemed? Redeemed from human pettiness, from human cruelty, one to the other. Is this how we treat the children of God? My father was tormented by the war in Vietnam, and he wanted very much for Dr. King to speak out against the war, and at the same time he was concerned what would it do to the civil rights movement. As you know, that was very difficult in those days. We were speaking earlier about Dr. King's speech, famous speech at Riverside Church in 1967. I was there that night, and I remember vividly in the months prior how my father worried about whether this was the right thing to encourage Dr. King to speak out. And when I look back at that, I realize too that for my father, everything political was actually a moral issue. What was the right thing to do? What was the religious thing to do? Should he even encourage Dr. King to speak out? What was his personal responsibility? Because he always asked, what am I doing? And yet he was tormented. My father once went to a demonstration against the war in Vietnam, and a journalist came over to him in a very unfriendly way and said, "What are you doing here?" And my father said, "I'm here because I can't pray." And the journalist said, "You can't pray, so you come to a demonstration?" And my father said, "When I open the prayer book, I see before me children burning from napalm." He had to. What made him extremely upset one night was when he heard about the My Lai massacre. And he was so upset that the news had been broken by journalists and not by the chaplains, the people that he had been teaching. And so I want to come back to the Seder in 1968 that might have been and what it would have been like. You know, my father married a woman who grew up in Cleveland and went to Glenville High School, my mother. And she studied piano here in Cleveland. Some of her cousins are here who remember her. And the first thing my parents did after they got married, their wedding was in LA where my grandparents had moved. First thing they did was to come to Cleveland to celebrate their honeymoon here. My mother, who was a wonderful pianist, didn't especially like cooking. Before Passover, my mother spent weeks and weeks in the kitchen preparing, taking down the, you know what it's like, the Passover dishes, and they had to be cleaned, the whole kitchen had to be scrubbed, etc. The silverware had to be boiled, and the glassware had to go into water for 3 days, and everything had to be transformed, etc. All the countertops covered, the refrigerator and the stove. It's a huge job. And so at our Seder, what would it have been like? First of all, every year my mother would sit down, exhausted, and say, "Only women appreciate Passover because only we know what it is to slave in the kitchen." Our Seders were small, very traditional. Everything was in Hebrew with some translations in English and some discussion, you know, about the meaning of different passages that people would bring up. My parents usually had about 12 people at the Seder, various friends, and a couple of cousins. But I think about one passage in particular where it says, there are 4 sons, a wise, a wicked, a simple, and one who doesn't ask a question. Everybody knows that. But did you ever notice that for why is the wicked son called wicked and the wise son called wise? Because in fact, the language that they use is very similar. One asks, what is this religious occasion for you? What does this mean that God has commanded to you? And the other one says, what is this service to you? But they're both saying you in the plural. But one is wise and one is wicked. Why is that? Well, there's a wonderful explanation that my father brought that I think also had something to do with the civil rights movement and the reason for his involvement in political issues.